Hello, my name is Joel Bennett, and I'd like to welcome you to the 4th episode of The Power of 5. During this video series, you'll hear 5 consultants from all over the world on topics related to leadership. We hope that as a result of sharing our thoughts today, you'll consider different perspectives, find ways of applying them to your own situations, and most importantly, leave with real actionable steps to embed them into your own leadership and culture. So here's the question for the panel. Leaders are just as likely to make mistakes as their own team members, but they're less likely to admit them for fear of losing the team's trust. So how does being vulnerable and owning mistakes impact the relationships that leaders have with their teams? Shawn, would you like to start us off?
Sure. I will challenge that right away by saying great leaders make the most mistakes and own the most mistakes. And I remember a couple of years ago, I had a client that called me up and said, hey, can you do an innovation workshop with my team? And, they don't really come up with any new ideas. So after, like 10 minutes of questioning, and I had worked with this client before, it wasn't so much that the team had no new ideas. They had a ton of new ideas. They were just terrified of sharing them. And so I said, here's what I'll do. You can call it innovation if you want. I'll put that on the invoice. But we're going to do, and I know that this is a family-rated show, so I won't say what the real title was, but it was, tell me your biggest F, and then up. So F up. But there are a couple other words in there. So all I did was had the leader start the session with his top 3 screw-ups that he has done, and he owned them. And it was not only the most fun workshop I think I've ever done, but it was the most real because it gave permission to everybody else. And I remember when he started, they were kind of looking at each other and going, what's going on? And then the head of sales came up and says, oh, that's nothing. Here's how I messed up. And very quickly, it changed the energy where everybody was sharing their mess ups. And the thing is, the truth is, the more honest and vulnerable we are, the better. It makes us more real. It gives permission for everybody to try. I have another client that they have like the donkey of the month, like the biggest mess up of the month. But also when you have that spirit of trying and not hitting it out of the park every time, it starts with the top being open, honest, vulnerable. So I think being vulnerable and honest is a trait of leadership in any time.
Do you think the other thing that you just said there, Shawn, also is that you actually celebrate the mess ups and the failures and actually make a big deal of it instead of trying to hide it, which I think is really important.
I think that leads to the whole culture of experimentation. I remember a friend saying years ago, I had mentioned that everything's an experiment. Like, who knows? Some go well, some don't, but everything's an experiment. And when we have that spirit, and when we look at the companies that we celebrated being so innovative, especially during the last 4 months that have pivoted and all these fancy words, they probably already had that culture.
Yeah. And when you talk
for celebrating fuck.
Very good. Go ahead, Todd.
No, I was going to say, if you're celebrating fuck ups, like I could get a ticker tape parade for myself. Because
oh, great. Now this moved to PG-13, Todd. Thanks for that.
Sorry about that. But here's the thing, right? Because, Shawn, like to your point, like how can you possibly do something and get it perfect every single time? Like you can't, right? And so like it's all about humanizing, and I want to know that the leader that I'm following is as human as I am, because if they're perfect, I'm not. So it's going to feel really awkward following behind them, right? It's like, screw it up. It happens. Keep going. It means you're trying. It means you're doing something. You're doing something real. So have at it. Sorry, Catherine, I cut you off.
No, yeah, you know what? You should be sorry.
I am sorry, deeply. But you know what? I get a parade.
That was a huge mistake, Todd.
That's right. Yeah.
I'll tag on to that, which is people. My experience is people don't trust people who don't admit to mistakes, right? So you don't really connect fundamentally, deeply, authentically with people who never make mistakes or never admit to mistakes, are always perfect. So if you're looking for, what we always talk about is that real connection with people in your organization to innovate, to experiment, as you say, Shawn, right? To actually truly pivot during times of opportunity, that fallibility, that visual fallibility is the only way you can experiment and innovate and fail and fall down and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And I know one thing that made me think of right off the bat is the most popular TED Talks are not the ones of people standing up going, I'd like to stand here and tell you how awesome I am and how I've just succeeded throughout my whole life. They always talk about a challenge where they had to overcome something, where they screwed up, and people connect with that, right? It resonates with them.
Yeah, there's a
Totally
conference
agree.
now around it, is there not? I think, no, I'm actually being serious. I believe there's actually a
I
conference.
thought you
around
meant
that where-
TED.
Yeah, no,
That's
that's
right.
what I
Hey,
was
have
like.
you heard
Yeah.
of this TED thing? Yeah, this TED thing seems to be catching on. Yeah.
I think this show is a perfect example. I know this is a like perfectly polished product, but believe it or not, go back to episode 1. There was a couple of mistakes there, but hey, we're now here in episode 4. Just get on the field and start doing it and experimenting. And I think that leads, because a lot of organizations say they're open, but they're not really, right? And you can see when people are scared of sharing things or sharing in a meeting, or if they get shot down right away, good luck getting another idea out of them.
Yeah.
Do you
I got a
think going
question for
back
you,
to
Mandy.
Joel's? Oh, yep.
Yeah, well, because you were talking about the celebration, and have you seen stuff from your clients where they celebrate mistakes really well?
No, I haven't. And that's that's where
anyone?
it's really interesting, because like there was a huge one of our really big organizations in Australia, won't mention them. I had become part of their sort of suite of suppliers that they were using, and they brought us all in to talk to us about their new values. And one of their new values was innovation, and then another one was courage. And I stupidly asked the question, if they if they were serious about innovation, then they had to get serious about people making mistakes and failing, and then therefore having the courage to support them. And I asked them, how they were planning to do that, and you should have seen the horrified looks on their faces. Well, we're not going to make mistakes. And I think it's that whole idea of, if you've got innovation, like Shawn was saying, then you have to expect people to make mistakes. And the trick is to fail fast, right? And I always love, I'm sure you've seen that acronym around FAIL, first attempt in learning. I remember saying that to my girls one day, and they burst out laughing, rolled their eyes, and said, yeah, you should tell teachers that one day. And I just think, our whole education system, our cultures do not support people making mistakes and actually celebrating them. Yeah. So I really haven't seen, which is sad, I haven't seen anybody celebrate mistakes.
To that point, I mean, I don't have any clients that do it well. And I think I do a lot of work with manufacturing companies who are all about process and lean and continuous improvement, and all that's fantastic. But I think the more process there is in a organization, sometimes the more that they not only fear failure, but essentially will kind of shout people down for their own mistakes and failures, right? It'd be interesting to see what that's like in other industries that are highly process oriented, whether it's healthcare or others, where truthfully, like in healthcare, a mistake could mean somebody's life, right? So we don't want to have mistakes, but at the same time, does that get in the way of innovative practice or rethinking the way that we do things, because we're so afraid that, a small mistake may raise the ire of my leader or my team or others.
Well, and you know what, Joel?
Sorry, go ahead, Catherine.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, it doesn't just thwart innovation. It actually, there was a great talk, and I can't remember the author of a psychological safety video, but she referred to, not only does it thwart innovation, it actually is very risky to the organization. And you mentioned healthcare, and she talked about, if you work in an organization where people are absolutely terrified of admitting to a mistake, they will make those mistakes, they will hide those mistakes, and actually fundamental safety is possibly at risk. Like, what if it's a pilot? What if you're a new physician? What if there are a lot of ways that by cultivating that complete aversion to any sort of risk, mistake, or failure will result in significant negative consequences. So it's not even that you don't get to innovate; it's that there's some serious consequences attached to that.
Yeah, and I think
totally. Well, it's.
Go ahead, Todd.
Sorry, go ahead. No, I was going to say it's that classic example of if you're a little kid and you come home with your report card, if your parents react well to it, then you're good to show it again. But if they react badly to it, you don't want to show them the report card anymore. It doesn't change the result. It just changes whether you get to find out about the result. And, so it's really our reaction to that vulnerability. Joel, sorry.
No, that's okay. Where I was going with that is, I think for many teams, many organizations, if we aren't willing to admit our mistakes and aren't willing to own them and learn from them, we also are taking away a gift to others, which is that they can learn from our mistakes. And so, it's kind of this, it's a little bit of kind of the Einstein's, definition of insanity. It's we're doing the same things over and over again, getting the same result or expecting a different result, but we're actually doing different things and failing at it, but acting like we're doing the same things over and over again. So I don't think there's enough focus in organizations around, in some ways, a little bit of a misery loves company, right? To be able to say, hey, I screwed up, or this didn't go the way I planned it to. I'm going to give you guys the gift of learning from me, right? And maybe you can give me some tips or hints to get me back on track, and I can do the same based on my own experience.
And Joel, to your point too about healthcare, sometimes it's just challenging our assumptions and changing the question or the lens that we look at. And I know the Heath brothers have written a couple of books, and one of my favorite examples was a hospital that had not such a glowing track record and a lot of infections and death and so on. And what they ended up doing was having the nurses or the people in the operating room actually read out 4 or 5 simple questions like, hey, did you wash your hands? And at first we'd be like, oh my God, I could never ask the doctor. They would think, I'm way below their pay grade. And that one little thing changed everything, and the results were astonishing. And so I think sometimes it's also within the system that even when we see things, we don't want to say anything. And it's kind of changing the lens. So even in healthcare, I'm sure that when the consultants came up with, hey, why don't you ask the doctor these questions? They were probably laughed out of the office until the metrics came in and the results came in.
Do you think, I know one of the things, and I don't know if you've ever seen it, there's a video on YouTube, and it's called The Blue Angels, and it's about fighter pilots who now fly in formation and all that kind of stuff and do shows. And it's so good, where it talks about the power of debriefing. And I just love the fact, like I talk about that all the time in our leadership programs about debriefing. What are you laughing at, Catherine?
Go ahead and say it, Catherine.
I've done a blooper, haven't I? What's the Blue Angels? I don't know. Have I? No. Okay, you'll tell me in a moment. So the power of debriefing is the fact that, and I don't think people do it well enough, right? Because they don't want to expose their mistakes. But if we make it okay to actually, and so what they do is, like, they have, like, I don't know, 3 or 4 minutes of flying in formation. And what happens is they spend almost 3 times that time debriefing. And that to me is the ratio. And that's what I say to people, is that's the only way you can learn, is to actually open up. It's a bit like you've got your questions beforehand, but let's also do our questioning afterwards. And make it okay that, and their thing around it is everyone takes their lapels off. We're all the same. There's no ego involved. And I think that's really powerful. And I think there's 2 ends to it. I think, debriefing on the actual performance. But I know something that I used to do when I was an auditor in a large accounting firm as a manager, I would create a sandpit for people to practice in. So in particularly, if the risks are high in the medical, I don't think we give people, we do it in IT, where they have the sandpit when they're using a new system and they throw people into the sandpit to experiment with it. but we don't do that live in the workplace often enough and give people a place to play and make it a little safer for them to make mistakes.
Yeah. You know, that's funny that you say that, because it makes me think of many of the clients that I work with, really bright and experienced and incredible people who have the best intentions. And, you know, they would all be saying, yes, that's a great idea. We have after action review as part of our thing. We have practice and, you know, role play as part of our practice opportunities. But then they say, well, we don't have any time to actually implement that. Or even in the role play, even in the practice session, nobody wants to look stupid. So they don't actually practice as though, you know, it's game day. So even that level of mistrust or risk aversion shows up even when I think most people, to your point, Mandy, would say, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We should, of course, do an after action review. We should, of course, sort of muck about in the sandpit and like, let's, you know, do a dress rehearsal. So that's how far down I think this cultural allergy to failure goes.
I think it's too that if the company's sailing along making money, everybody's getting their bonuses, they're not really motivated to do anything different. And the last 4 months, necessity, you know, we had to, and for a lot it was just survival. The other quick thing that I'll say is, and I used to say this all the time, I would get invited to the annual sales meetings of companies, and I would say, are you putting the same 30 people in the same room with the same problem last year? Going back to Joel's definition of insanity. Really? And I think, Mandy, I know you do a lot of work too of groups when you mix the cultures, because people tend to hang out. Bankers hang out with bankers. Insurance people hang out, you know, manufacturing, and they wonder why there's no creativity. Let's mix them all up. Put them in a room, and that's where you'll get some new thinking.
But it's even the same organization with the different populations of leaders. So I'm working with a new client right now, and it's really quite fascinating that I'm getting real serious pushback that I've got senior leaders and emerging leaders in the same group. And so the senior leaders feel uncomfortable talking when emerging leaders are in the groups. But then on the other hand, they're saying, oh, look, I know all this stuff about deep connection and having conversations. And I'm laughing, going, no, you don't. You don't even want to have a conversation with the emerging leader that's in your group, because, you know, we don't mix. It's fascinating that people just don't see how they let their ego and just their fear get in the way. And yeah, it takes people like us to grab them by the shoulders and give them a bit of a rattle, so to speak. But yeah.
But I mean, like from 6 feet away though, right? I mean, just
yeah,
exactly.
Social.
You know,
Can you put that in meters, please, Joel?
It's at least 1 meter. Got nothing else for you.
I think it's really interesting when we talk about this relationship between trust and vulnerability too, is that we are looking for people to be vulnerable and real and make mistakes, and that's what builds our trust with them. But when it comes to systems, we're not looking for them to be vulnerable. In fact, we trust the ones that are not. Right. So when there's a reliability to a system and we know it's going to work, that builds our trust. But in the people, when there's a vulnerability, that builds our trust. So it's a really unique relationship there.
Well, with the time that we've got left, I think there are a couple things that are raising for me. You know, Mandy, you mentioned the word debrief or using debriefs in organizations. So I'll share a mistake I made a number of years ago. Is I'm big on reflecting as teams on what worked, what didn't work. But a number of times I use the word post-mortem, which in many contexts would be fine. And people got what I meant. But during a one-on-one with one of the folks on my team, I had said, well, you know, let's do a post-mortem on that. And they said, can you stop using that word? And I said, sure, why? And they said, because no one died. And it just kind of sunk into me very quickly. The words I was using were reinforcing that this was like a life and death situation. And when I started using things like debrief or reflection, all of a sudden the tenor changed. So I think it's important for us to just think about the language we use, the way that we respond to mistakes and failures, and just even if it's not a mistake or a failure, somebody being willing to kind of step out of their comfort zone and share something that may not necessarily paint them in a perfect light. Because perfection, as you guys have said, is not the goal. What we're looking for is progress, right? And progress in the right direction. So, well, this has been great. And I'd like to end our time today with just an opportunity for each of you to share your own key takeaways. Catherine, do you want to start us?
Well, I guess a simple action step might be to just reflect on when, for the leaders who might be watching right now, to reflect on when was the last time that you proactively shared a failure or a mistake with your team. And if so, what did you notice? What did you notice about the conversation? What did you notice about yourself as you were getting ready to share that, or as you decided to jump into that? And what did you notice about the response? And how might you continue to cultivate that conversation about embracing, risk, and embracing making mistakes and failure, and leading by example? So I think the first step is really just noticing, like, am I doing this? And if not, how can I just begin to do that?
Yeah.
And I think if you take that, if I go from there, then create a routine, and like we talked about in our last episode, be intentional about unwrapping mistakes. And as the leader, you are the one that has to role model that and step in and start creating the culture of making it okay and actually celebrating failure. So I think it's that intention and routine and practice and discipline to actually do it.
And Mandy, I couldn't agree more. I love your debrief. I love, the phrase "show them, don't tell them." I use a process with my coaching clients called review the game film, because I'm kind of a sports nut. And it used to be, in the old days, you would go at halftime of the football game and review what you did in the first half and then make adjustments. But now every sport, the players have the iPads on the bench. They get on the bench. They might be on the bench for 2 minutes. They're looking at the last time, and that's the speed of it. And I say that's what professional athletes do. That's what professionals do. So what do you do? And obviously, with that guilt some into it, but if you make that part of your weekly process, which I do, or even daily, what went well, what didn't, what are we going to change? That soon becomes part of the language. And to your point, Joel, the language is really important.
Yeah, and I think along those same lines is giving that intentional permission to fail. I talk to so many leaders and say, yeah, of course, my people know that they can take, they can work on this. And if they don't get it right, we'll work. They don't know. So seeing you, hearing those stories, giving them full permission, like, guys, if you got it 80%, let's call that 100, knowing that there's probably 20% that we don't even know about yet, because you don't know what you don't know. So, first swing at the bat, if you got 80%, great. Next time it's going to be 90%, and you keep on going. But permission to fail, because if you stick to it's got to be 100% or nothing, you'll get nothing.
Good. Well, I'd like to thank each of you for sharing your thoughts on the topic, as well as just thanking all of our viewers for joining us today. If you found this useful, keep an eye out for future episodes where we'll continue to examine what it takes to be an effective leader. So on behalf of the group, goodbye for now, and we'll see you soon.
Cheers, guys.
Bye.
Thanks, guys.